The dust cloud rose high into the azure sky as Delilah Daniels struggled against the rope binding her wrists, her body bouncing painfully over the rugged terrain of the Montana Territory in 1878. Each rock and ridge scraped against her once fine dress, now tattered and stained with blood and earth. Her captors, a gang of rustlers led by the notorious Silas Jenkins, laughed as they drove the wagon forward, dragging her behind like a rag doll. Her crime had been simple yet damning in their eyes. She had witnessed them robbing the general store in Silver Creek, and for that, she was to be made an example. "Please!" she cried out, her voice barely audible over the rumble of wheels and hoofs. "I won't tell anyone!" But her pleas fell on deaf ears as the wagon continued its merciless journey across the vast prairie. Miles away, Mason Mackenzie was tracking a stray from his herd when he noticed the unusual dust cloud in the distance. At 26, Mason had spent most of his life on horseback, working cattle and living by the unwritten code of the West. He'd seen his share of ugliness since coming to Montana 5 years prior, but something about the strange procession ahead made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Through his spyglass, he could make out a wagon with 5 riders, but what caught his eye was the dark shape bouncing behind it. He urged his stallion, Thunder, forward, keeping a ridge between himself and the group until he was close enough to see clearly. What he saw made his blood run cold. A woman, her dress in tatters, being dragged behind the wagon like an animal. Without hesitation, Mason pulled his Winchester rifle from its scabbard and checked the load. He might be outnumbered, but he couldn't stand by while such cruelty took place. With a whispered command to Thunder, he broke from cover and galloped toward the wagon. The rustlers noticed him too late. By the time they reached for their weapons, Mason had already put 2 bullets into the air, causing the horses pulling the wagon to rear up in panic. "Stop right there!" he shouted, bringing Thunder to a halt between the wagon and the battered woman. In one fluid motion, he dismounted, keeping his rifle trained on the men while pulling his hunting knife from his belt. "This ain't your business, cowboy," snarled the leader, his hand hovering over his pistol. "I'm making it my business," Mason replied, his voice steady despite the fury coursing through him. He knelt beside the woman, who looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. With a quick slash of his knife, he cut through the rope binding her to the wagon, careful not to touch her bloodied wrists. "You're making a mistake," the leader warned. "She's a witness. She'll bring the law down on us." Mason stood, positioning himself between the woman and the 5 men. "The mistake was yours. Now you have 2 witnesses." He cocked his rifle for emphasis. "And I'm not as easy to drag behind a wagon." The standoff hung in the air for several tense moments before the leader spat on the ground. "This ain't over." With a jerk of his head, he signaled his men to move on, and they slowly rode away, casting dark glances over their shoulders. Once they were a safe distance away, Mason turned his attention to the woman. She was barely conscious, her face streaked with dirt and blood, her blonde hair matted with dust. "Miss? Can you hear me?" he asked, gently lifting her head. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of the summer sky. "Yes," she whispered, her voice raspy from screaming and thirst. "I'm Mason Mackenzie. I'm going to help you. Can you tell me your name?" "Delilah," she managed, wincing as she tried to move. "Delilah Daniels." "Well, Miss Daniels, we need to get you somewhere safe and tend to those wounds." He offered her his canteen, helping her take small sips of water. "My ranch is about an hour's ride from here. Do you think you can hold on that long?" She nodded weakly, and with careful movements, Mason lifted her onto Thunder, mounting behind her and cradling her against his chest to keep her steady. He could feel her trembling, whether from fear or pain, he couldn't tell. "Those men," she murmured as they began to ride away. "They robbed the general store in Silver Creek. Killed the shopkeeper. I was just there to pick up supplies." "Shh," Mason soothed, urging Thunder into a gentle lope. "You're safe now. We'll worry about those men later." The journey to Mason's ranch seemed to take an eternity. He kept his pace steady, mindful of Delilah's injuries, and by the time they crested the hill overlooking his modest homestead, she had fallen into a fitful sleep against his chest. The ranch wasn't much, a small cabin, a barn, and a corral where several horses grazed, but it was home. Mason had built it with his own hands after coming west, determined to make something of himself after years of drifting. He'd started with just a few head of cattle and had slowly built his herd to a respectable size. It wasn't the biggest spread in the territory, but it was his, and for the first time, he felt a fierce pride in the simple life he'd carved out of the wilderness. Mason's ranch hand, an older man named Hank Williams, came out of the barn as they approached, his weathered face creasing with concern when he saw the woman in Mason's arms. "What in tarnation happened?" Hank asked, hurrying to help Mason dismount without jostling Delilah. "Found her being dragged behind a wagon by Jenkins and his gang," Mason explained, carefully lifting her down. "She needs tending." Hank's expression darkened. "Jenkins? That no good snake. I'll fetch some hot water and bandages. You take her inside." Mason carried Delilah into the cabin and laid her gently on his bed. In the lamplight, her injuries looked even worse. Abrasions covered her arms and legs, and a deep gash ran along her hairline. He removed her torn boots to reveal badly swollen ankles. Hank returned with a basin of water, clean rags, and a bottle of whiskey. "I'll ride for the doctor," he offered. Mason nodded. "Be careful. Jenkins and his boys might still be around." After Hank left, Mason set about the delicate task of cleaning Delilah's wounds. She stirred as he dabbed at the cut on her forehead, her eyes opening in momentary panic before focusing on his face. "You're at my ranch," he explained softly. "I'm just cleaning these cuts. My ranch hand has gone for the doctor." Delilah tried to sit up but gasped in pain. "My father. He'll be worried sick." "I was supposed to be back in Silver Creek by nightfall." "Silver Creek is a half-day's ride from here," Mason said. "When you're stronger, I'll get word to your family. For now, you need to rest." She reluctantly settled back, wincing as he continued to clean her wounds. "Those men. They're dangerous. They'll come after you for interfering." "Let them try," Mason replied, his jaw set in determination. "I've dealt with their kind before." As he worked, they talked in quiet tones. Delilah told him about her life in Silver Creek, where she had moved with her father after her mother's death 2 years prior. Her father was the town's schoolteacher, a gentle man who had taught her to love books and learning. She had been helping him by teaching the younger children. In turn, Mason shared bits of his own story, how he'd left his home in Pennsylvania at 18, worked on cattle drives in Texas, and eventually saved enough to buy his small ranch in Montana. He told her about his dreams of expanding his herd and making something of himself in this wild country. By the time the doctor arrived, a fragile trust had formed between them. Dr. Bennett, a gruff but kind man, examined Delilah thoroughly, pronouncing her lucky to be alive but in need of several weeks' rest to recover from her ordeal. "Those rope burns on her wrists need careful watching," he instructed Mason. "Clean them twice daily with carbolic solution. The cut on her head won't need stitching, but keep it clean. It's the internal bruising I'm most concerned about." After the doctor left, Mason prepared a simple meal of beans and biscuits. He helped Delilah sit up to eat, propping her with pillows. The color had begun to return to her cheeks, and despite everything, she managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Mason felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through him at her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." She shook her head. "No, they wouldn't. Most men would have ridden the other way, especially knowing it was Jenkins' gang." She looked down at her bandaged wrists. "You risked your life for a stranger." "That's not something anyone would do." That night, Mason slept on a pallet near the fireplace, leaving his bed to Delilah. He lay awake long into the night, listening to her soft breathing and thinking about the turn his quiet life had taken. There was something about Delilah Daniels that stirred feelings he'd long since buried, feelings of protectiveness, yes, but something more, something he wasn't quite ready to name. The next morning, Mason sent Hank to Silver Creek with a message for Delilah's father, explaining what had happened and assuring him that his daughter was safe and being cared for. He also included a warning about Jenkins and his gang, suggesting that Mr. Daniels alert the sheriff. Over the next few days, Delilah's strength gradually returned. She insisted on helping around the cabin despite Mason's protests, setting the table for meals and even attempting to cook, though her bandaged hands made it difficult. "I can't just lie in bed all day," she insisted when Mason found her struggling to knead dough for biscuits. "I'll go mad with boredom." He couldn't help but smile at her determination. "At least let me help," he offered, moving beside her at the table. Together, they prepared the evening meal, their hands occasionally brushing, sending unexpected sparks through Mason's veins. 5 days after her rescue, they received a visitor. Hank came riding in with a distinguished-looking older man, Theodore Daniels, Delilah's father. The reunion was tearful, with Mr. Daniels embracing his daughter carefully, mindful of her injuries. "When you didn't return, I feared the worst," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "If Mr. Mackenzie hadn't found you." "But he did, father," Delilah reminded him, casting a grateful glance at Mason. "He saved my life." Over dinner, Theodore Daniels shared news from town. The sheriff had formed a posse after hearing about the attack on Delilah and the murder of the shopkeeper, but Jenkins and his gang had disappeared into the mountains. "The sheriff believes they'll lie low for a while," Theodore explained. "But eventually they'll resurface. They always do. When they do, I'll be ready," Mason said quietly, meeting Delilah's concerned gaze across the table. Theodore insisted on taking Delilah home to Silver Creek, but the doctor, who had returned to check on his patient, advised against moving her so soon. "Another week of rest would be best," Dr. Bennett recommended. "Those internal injuries need time to heal." Reluctantly, Theodore agreed to leave Delilah in Mason's care for another week, promising to return with a wagon and proper bedding to make the journey back to Silver Creek as comfortable as possible. After her father left, Delilah seemed subdued. She sat by the window, gazing out at the mountains in the distance, lost in thought. "Are you worried about going home?" Mason asked, joining her. She turned to him, her blue eyes troubled. "I'm worried about what happens when Jenkins returns. He'll come after me, Mason. And now he'll come after you too." Mason took her hand, surprised at his own boldness. "Let him come. I won't let anything happen to you." The week passed too quickly. Each day, Mason found himself inventing reasons to stay close to the cabin rather than attend to his ranch duties. Hank teased him about it, but Mason didn't care. He enjoyed Delilah's company, her quick wit, and the way she listened intently when he spoke, as if his words truly mattered. They shared stories by the fire in the evenings, Delilah recounting tales from the books she loved, Mason describing the strange and beautiful things he'd seen in his travels. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, and Mason found himself wondering what it would be like if she stayed. The night before Theodore was due to return, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Delilah's injuries had healed remarkably well. Only the fading rope burns on her wrists remained as visible reminders of her ordeal. "I'll miss this," she said softly, gesturing to the vast landscape before them. "Silver Creek feels so confined compared to this openness." "You could visit," Mason suggested, his heart beating faster at the thought. "Any time." She turned to him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'd like that." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Mason leaned closer, drawn by an irresistible force. When their lips met, it felt like coming home after a long journey. Her hand came up to touch his face, and he marveled at the softness of her skin against his weathered cheek. When they parted, Delilah's eyes shimmered with emotions that mirrored his own. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. Mason took her hands in his. "Then don't. Not forever, at least. I know we've only known each other a short time, But I've never felt this way about anyone, Delilah. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Mason stood quickly, his hand moving to his pistol as he scanned the darkness beyond the porch. "Get inside," he ordered, suddenly alert to danger. Delilah obeyed, but not before touching his arm in concern. "Be careful," she urged. Mason moved to the edge of the porch, straining to identify the riders. To his relief, it was Hank returning from checking the north pasture, accompanied by one of the neighboring ranchers. "Mason!" Hank called as they rode into the yard. "Jenkins and his boys were spotted near Thompson's place this morning. They're heading this way." Mason's stomach tightened with dread. "How many?" "5, same as before," the neighbor, Bill Thompson, answered. "They burned my hay barn. Said they were looking for the cowboy who interfered with their business." Mason turned to Delilah, who stood in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said. "They're coming for us." Throughout the night, they prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Mason sent Hank to alert other ranchers in the area and to fetch the sheriff from Silver Creek, though he knew help might not arrive in time. He showed Delilah how to load and fire his spare revolver, ignoring her trembling hands. "I can't ask you to fight them," she protested. "This is my fault." "No," Mason said firmly. "This is Jenkins' fault. And I won't let him hurt you again." They barricaded the windows and doors, moving furniture to create defensive positions. By dawn, exhausted but resolute, they waited in tense silence for whatever would come. The attack began just after sunrise. A volley of gunfire shattered the morning quiet, bullets splintering the cabin's wooden walls. Mason pushed Delilah down behind an overturned table, returning fire through a narrow window. "We know you're in there, Cowboy!" Jenkins' voice called out. "Send out the woman, and maybe we'll let you live." "Go to hell, Jenkins!" Mason shouted back, firing another shot that sent one of the rustlers scrambling for cover. The exchange of gunfire continued for what felt like hours but was likely only minutes. Mason was acutely aware of their dwindling ammunition and the fragility of their shelter. If Jenkins and his men decided to rush the cabin or set it ablaze, they would have few options. In a brief lull, Delilah touched his arm. "I could go out there," she whispered. "Distract them somehow. Give you a chance to—" "No!" Mason cut her off, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We stay together." The sound of fresh hoofbeats drew their attention. Through the window, Mason saw riders approaching from the east, a dozen men led by the Silver Creek sheriff, and, to his surprise, Delilah Daniels. "Looks like the cavalry's arrived," he said with grim satisfaction. The ensuing gunfight was chaotic but decisive. Outnumbered and outflanked, Jenkins and his gang were quickly subdued. 2 of the rustlers were killed in the exchange, 1 was wounded, and Jenkins himself and the remaining man were captured. When it was over, Mason emerged from the cabin with Delilah at his side, both dirty and exhausted but unharmed. Theodore rushed to embrace his daughter while the sheriff approached Mason with grudging respect. "That was some stand you made," Sheriff Harmon acknowledged. "Jenkins has been terrorizing these parts for too long. Thanks to you and Miss Daniels, we finally have him." Later, as the prisoners were being led away and the neighbors who'd come to help were dispersing, Theodore pulled Mason aside. "I can never repay what you've done for my daughter," he said solemnly. "First saving her life, then protecting her from those villains." Mason shook his head. "No payment necessary, sir. I care deeply for your daughter." Theodore studied him thoughtfully. "I can see that. And I believe she feels the same. She's never been one to follow convention, my Delilah." He smiled slightly. "If your intentions are honorable, young man, you should know I won't stand in your way." That evening, after the excitement had died down and Theodore had returned to town with the sheriff, Mason found Delilah by the corral, watching the horses in the fading light. "Your father's a good man," he said, coming to stand beside her. She nodded. "He is. He raised me to think for myself, to follow my heart." She turned to face him. And my heart is telling me something I never expected. Mason took her hands in his thumbs gently tracing the healing marks on her wrists. What's it telling you? That sometimes, the most unexpected encounters can change everything. She stepped closer. I was being dragged behind a wagon, thinking I was going to die, and then you appeared like something from a dream. You cut me free, not just from that rope, but from a life that suddenly seems too small. Mason's heart swelled with emotion. I never believed in fate until I saw you through that spyglass. Something told me I had to reach you, had to help you. Now I know why. He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and possibility. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the moment. I know it's fast, he said, but I've never been more certain of anything. Stay with me, Delilah. Not just for now, but for always. She smiled, her eyes shining with tears and hope. Yes, she whispered. Yes. The wedding took place in Silver Creek 2 months later, after a proper courtship that had the town buzzing with the romantic tale of the schoolteacher's daughter and the cowboy who had saved her. Theodore gave his blessing wholeheartedly, moved by the obvious love between his daughter and Mason. After the ceremony, they returned to the ranch, which no longer seemed small or modest to Delilah but perfect in every way. Mason had added a room to the cabin during their engagement, creating a bright space filled with bookshelves for Delilah's beloved collection. That night, as they stood on the porch watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Montana sky, Mason wrapped his arms around his bride. Happy? He asked softly. Delilah leaned back against him, secure in his embrace. More than I ever thought possible. She turned in his arms to face him. You know, most love stories don't begin with someone being dragged behind a wagon. Mason laughed, the sound rumbling in his chest. Ours was never going to be an ordinary love story, was it? No, she agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. But it's ours, and that makes it perfect. In the years that followed, their love only deepened. The ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding to become one of the most successful in the territory. Delilah started a small school for the children of neighboring ranchers, fulfilling her passion for teaching while remaining close to home. Their first child, a daughter named Lillian, arrived exactly 1 year after their wedding, followed 2 years later by a son, James. The children grew strong and free in the wide open spaces of Montana, learning the ways of the ranch from their father, and the joy of books and learning from their mother. Sometimes, on warm summer evenings, Mason and Delilah would sit on the porch, watching their children play in the yard, and marvel at the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. The scars on Delilah's wrists had faded to thin white lines, barely visible now, but they served as a reminder of how precious their life together was. Do you ever think about that day? Delilah asked once, tracing the lines on her wrist thoughtfully. Mason covered her hand with his own. Every day. Not the fear or the danger, but the moment I first saw you. How brave you were, even then. I wasn't brave, she protested. I was terrified. That's what bravery is, he insisted. Being afraid but enduring anyway. He kissed her softly. You're still the bravest person I know. As their children grew and the ranch flourished, Mason and Delilah became fixtures in the community, respected and admired for their generosity and strength. Theodore Daniels eventually retired from teaching and moved to the ranch, building a small cottage nearby where he delighted in spoiling his grandchildren and helping with their education. Silas Jenkins and his surviving gang members were sentenced to long terms in the territorial prison. Their reign of terror finally ended. The story of how Mason had rescued Delilah became something of a legend in those parts, embellished with each telling until it sounded more like a tall tale than actual events. Mason and Delilah would laugh about these exaggerated versions, preferring the truth of their own memories, the real fear, the genuine courage, and the authentic love that had grown from that harrowing beginning. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Mason surprised Delilah with a locket containing miniature portraits of their children. Inside the lid, he had inscribed a simple message. You were worth the risk. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Delilah whispered, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't seen me that day? If you had taken a different trail or decided not to investigate?" Mason drew her closer, his hand gentle on her face. "I don't believe that was ever possible. Some things are meant to be, and I was meant to find you." In that moment, with the moon casting silver light through the window and the sounds of the Montana night surrounding them, they both knew it was true. Their story, beginning with terror and violence but blossoming into enduring love, was one that had been written in the stars long before either of them knew it. And as they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, safe and content in the home they had built together, they were grateful for every step of the journey, even the painful ones, that had brought them to this perfect happiness.